Hello, welcome to UMD Media's show. Today, we'll be covering genocidal consolidation of power as the final solution for elite rivalry. UMD Media strives to contribute to the understanding, measuring, and doing aspects of decision-driven, evidence-driven decision making and discourse in the Horn of Africa. Today, it's my great pleasure to have Dr. um, Van der Maat. Dr. Van der Maat, welcome to the MD Media Show.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Great. We are live on Facebook, two platforms, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. So we are everywhere today. And the topic is of interest given this media has been working on covering the Tigray genocide, and there is a lot to uncover. We don't claim to understand everything yet, but we know there are a number of factors. So I came across your paper from 2020, but
hmm
I gather there is a lot to that. So for our viewers, I just want to make some introduction here, and you will add into that. So Dr. Van der Maat is a university lecturer at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and his area of research is interesting, covering mass violence and genocide, international security, comparative politics, dictators, all that. And part of the interest in your work is, like I mentioned, what is happening in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. But I know in this paper, as we will cover in this show, there is a lot to genocidal power consolidation. And this is a list of his publications, including the paper we'll be talking about, the 2020 paper, and that's based on a 2015 dissertation on the same topic. This is a dissertation. I encourage those who are interested in the subject matter to read his dissertation. But if you are for uh, paper format, a peer-reviewed format that's published on international organization. This is in 2020, fall 2020. So, Dr. Van der Maat, first off, you might also introduce yourself, and I want also to ask you to paint a picture how you ended up working on this subject matter.
Okay. Well, I'm Dr. Van der Maat. I'm assistant professor at Leiden University, and I study genocide and authoritarian regimes. And the way I sort of rolled into this because genocide, mass killings of civilians, it's puzzling. It's it's incomprehensible, right? We sort of can understand hatreds, violence, and at a low scale, but to do so at a large scale is puzzling. For one, because of the humanitarian cost, but on the other hand, it's also puzzling because uh, there's no clear benefit to targeting civilians on the basis of who they are. So whenever regimes do so, and whenever if we're targeted on the basis of who we are, on the color of our skin, our eyes, our ethnicity, our religion, there isn't much that we can do. We can flee or resist. And that's why this indiscriminate violence, this mass violence, generates resistance from civilians that can flee or resist. It solves all sorts of coordination problems. If I can be a very repressive regime, but if you know that I'm not necessarily targeting you as long as you are sort of keeping to its regulations, then you can sort of keep your head on by keeping it down, and everybody wants to do that. But when I target you because of who you are, you have little choice but to resist, as have others. And the difficulty of resistance and coordinating a resistance suddenly become so much easier simply for this government to target civilians. And so it doesn't make sense to target civilians. It's not good policy. And that led me to the puzzle, okay, why does it happen? And I did not have a clear answer, hence my study that tried to find an answer to that question.
Interesting. Yeah, I think what you are saying uh, definitely echoes with many people who are struggling as we speak on why am I targeted for who I am and what is the option I am left with, right? So that we see when people think they can eliminate, avoid this hurdle to whatever they want in power to do in power, they see that the resistance becomes stronger and stronger. So maybe on terminologies, because you just mentioned about violence, mass violence, and so on.
Mhm.
In, both in the dissertation and in your paper, you differentiate between different types of or categories of mass violence. Walk us through that terminology, and we'll come back all as well to the very topic of it itself. What do we mean
Okay.
by viral
Okay.
consolidation?
So let us start with uh, I have different cutoffs, but let us start with violence itself, and let us make the difference between selective and indiscriminate violence. So selective violence, also according to Calivas, is violence that is targeted and based on the behavior of the victim. And what does that do? Well, if you transgress, if you break the rules, if you resist the government, we may kill you, we may kill your family, we may put you in prison, but it is selective. It's based on the behavior of individuals. So if individuals resist or if individuals break whatever norms the regime has, they are targeted. That's selective violence. And selective violence communicates to everyone. It's sort of the audience that sees, well, as long as I don't do that, as long as I don't rebel, as long as I don't resist, I'm going to be safe. And so selective violence creates control. Selective violence isn't easy because selective violence also requires information. So that's the problem. You need to know who is actually resisting you. And governments have all sorts of ways to deal with that. Now, indiscriminate violence is puzzling. Indiscriminate violence is not random violence, but it is violence that targets you not on the basis of your behavior, but on the basis of who you are, or where you are, or what religion you have. Right. So, indiscriminate violence can be random. Oftentimes, it's not random. So, in cases of genocides, there are clear targets, but it is indiscriminate because the targets are not. Uh, it's not based on their behavior. There's nothing you can do sort of to avoid the violence other than not be there or resist and make sure that you're okay and your family is okay. So that's selective violence versus indiscriminate violence. Now, in the paper, I also differentiate between two types of mass killing, mass indiscriminate violence, mass whether we call it genocide or not. Genocide is also a legal and a political term. So it's for me it's very hard to determine, well, this is a genocide or this is not. I like to speak of mass killing, mass violence, because it is just, well, this many people are killed and we don't know why. So there's two types that I identify. One is the counter-guerrilla mass violence, one that has been very well explained, which is that if you can't fight the guerrillas directly, you can drain the sea in which the guerrillas swim. Guerrillas need supplies, recruitment, information, and they get that from civilians. Not necessarily civilians of their own ethnicity, not necessarily, but the civilians in the areas in which the areas that the rebels control. Now, if a government really cannot fight a rebellion and it's a very costly rebellion and the government is has a potential of losing, that's when we sometimes see these mass killings whereby a strong government, a dominant government, tries to remove the civilian population in order to fight a guerrilla rebellion. That's the counter guerrilla mass violence. And that we see quite well often is not the word, but it occurs. For example, during the Boer Wars, um, or in Guatemala, whereby civilians are targeted to sort of disconnect the rebels from the population. Iraq, the Anfal operations. Also, all sorts of counter guerrilla, whereby the guerrilla is strong, the government can't find the guerrilla directly, and so they target the civilian support base of the guerrillas. Now, the thing is, guerrillas don't necessarily need uh, they don't need co-ethnics to support them, right? That what we see in Latin America, whereby the guerrillas are not necessarily co-ethnics of the local population. The guerrillas just need to be there. They come into a village, they have guns, and they get the support they need. So that's not necessary. Um, so a government, in order if they want to drain the sea, they will have to sort of remove civilians from the places where the guerrillas are active, which we see in the Anfal operations. And what we see when we look at these genocides and mass killings, that is not always what happens, right? Some mass killings are uh, they occur not necessarily where rebels are active. They don't necessarily occur during guerrilla. They are much more based on ethnicity than on where the rebels are, and we don't have good answers for these types of genocides, the ones that I dub potential genocidal consolidation.
Interesting. Yeah.
Does that
And
answer your
then,
question?
yeah, it does. I will also come back to that. So on this, on your study, what you did is looking at 54 years of data.
Hmm.
Uh, and maybe I think it's good to just tell us in terms of the cutoff. So there is even a number where you talk about 10,000 people killed and so on. So both in
It
terms of time and the threshold.
so I wanted to have a cutoff after the Second World War. Was that necessary? Well, Nazi Germany is a pretty weird case because with the Holocaust, it's one of the few countries that had a genocide when it was also fighting a war of expansion, and I think it's quite different. Most international relations looks at after the Second World War, and that is also a place in which a lot of data is available. So a lot of data sets and data availability starts with the end of the Second World War. Um, I think my earliest case is Mao 1949. And 2004 is also a number that, well, I started my PhD in 2010, and 2004 was a date in which a lot of data was available. A variety of data sources were available for that period, and which means that I could uh, compare and contrast these cases um, based on the same data. And so I had data for all these cases for this entire period, and I was able to get that. And where data was missing, I was able to collect it, insofar it was missing. And after 2004, several data sets ended. So some ended at 2004, some ended at 2006, but a lot of data sets that had been created ran until that time. So I made that the cutoff simply for feasibility reasons.
Mhm. Okay, great. One point that you mentioned there is there is for the rivalry for the elite in rivaling for power. There is the out group and the in group. And you painted, your framework talks about how everyone within the in group almost targets the out group, but then the machinery, once done with that out group, comes back to the in group to just push out or purge the rivalries there. So can you talk to this subject, like the out group and the in group, with the examples you have had in this
Yes, yes. So the out group and the in group. Um, so we don't have many explanations, right, for this genocide. If I may, existing explanations are hatred, ideology, or simply the rivalry, the fighting between the out and the in group, and that's all fine for some explanation, some cases, but not for all. Ideology is very common in these types of cases, but I thought there was also room for a more rational explanation. One thing that I found that we see time and time again in these mass killings is this extreme rivalry within the group, within the genocidal group. At the leadership of the genocidal group, there is competition, right? And let me say as much to say, well, this competition matters. Authoritarian regimes um, are in some ways the same as democratic regimes, right? They have some of the same pressures that they have. They want to. They also want to get power and have a well working economy, and do well. However, authoritarian regimes are also very much they want to control the population, right? They want to make sure that they stay in power and that the population doesn't rise up to them, and that's pretty much well understood. What's less understood is that authoritarian regimes that seem very unified are often have all sorts of factions and differences at the top of the regime. And this is common that there are some differences, but these differences can quite suddenly turn quite volatile and dangerous, uh, particularly because there's no reliable actor, there are no reliable institutions that sort of protect elites against other elites that might want them out. And because, well, we may be best friends, we may have fought in the independence war together. However, I cannot commit to keeping you safe. You cannot commit to keeping me safe. And so, even though we sort of trust each other, we both know we're better off without each other. And we both know of each other that we're better off without each other, and so we might both want to strike first. And so at times in authoritarian regimes, we see this rivalry pop up, right? Whereby leaders, second in commands, chiefs of staff, vice chairman challenge each other, and they're fighting for survival. And these elites at the top of a regime, they're all trying to sort of secure their own position, because if they don't, um, the outcome is often bad, right? If you lose the rivalry fight, you're often imprisoned, you may be forced into exile, or if you're unlucky, you're executed. So there's or killed, and that is for the leader and for generals, chiefs of staff, vice chairman. The people at the top are living in this fragile equilibrium. And when that breaks, everybody is trying to strengthen their own position. And what we see in these cases where we have this high elite rivalry, that different groups are trying to sort of create fait accomplis, right? They try to change the facts on the ground in order to strengthen their position and weaken that of rivals. Well, genocidal consolidation is one of these fait accomplis, right? Why? Well, a faction that facilitates violence against civilians can build new coalitions. They can build coalitions with people that gain from violence. Everywhere, in every country, in every society, there are people available that have most to gain from violence. For example, from looting, from status, the power that a gun gives. If you're homeless and unemployed, joining a militia is not a bad deal, right? You get some payment, you get something to eat, something to drink, and you can loot, and you get status. Suddenly, you're the big guy. You're the gangster, right? And so suddenly there's a lot of power, there's status, and so we authoritarian regimes sometimes pay militias with violence. Well, you go to this village, take whatever you want, or you are now the in control here. You are now the boss. And so violence, extreme violence against outgroups can build coalitions. They can help and create pro-government militias. And pro-government militias are not great. They're not great because they use a lot of indiscriminate violence, which generates resistance. They're not great because they're not actually, they don't fight wars to fight wars. They're not soldiers. It's quite easy to sort of repress civilians. That's what militias do. That's what they can do. Loot a little bit, push civilians around, take whatever you want. But well-structured troops and militias just, they are either killed, but usually they just flee in front of well-structured troops. So militias aren't that great. But in a competition with your rivals, it's good to have this private army that you can also set against potential traitors. Look, this general is a traitor to our country. Look, this burgomaster is a traitor to our country. They are not part. They are, for example, with the RPF. They are trying to support the enemy, and you can then use these militias to sort of throw sand in the engine and really pressure local officials to sort of step down, look away, or fight. Right, and that's the second mechanism here. Um, During genocidal consolidation is a little bit like a coup. Every local official wants to pick the winner, pick the winning team. You don't want to, it's there's this fight in the in group, and you don't want to end up being part of the losing team, because then you're a traitor and then you might be killed, or your family might be hurt. So what local officials, local officers try to do, they try to pick the winner. Well, with these militias, with all this violence going up in the country, who is the winner? Well, let's some will easily just join the violence, thereby switching sides from uh, the say an opposition to extremists, right? So they might pick sides. Some might just step down and not do anything, and some might resist. And the ones that resist, they we see, for example, in Rwanda, that they can resist quite effectively for a while. They can, if local officials that wanted to resist the genocide, Hutu officials could sort of gather Hutu and Tutsi, protect their own villages against the militias, keep order. The problem is obviously that's only part of the local officials will do so. And so the faction of the opposition, or the non-genocidal faction, will see itself weakened because they have defections, because they aren't targeted directly. The non-genocidal faction is not targeted directly. Their officers, their supporters are sort of allowed to join the other side. Who are targeted is the outgroup. The outgroup is targeted, and that is often not enough to really help coordinate the resistance from the opposition, from the in-group opposition, which is why we then see that at the start of this process, we often see this extreme rivalry. The two groups, they're roughly the same strength. So obviously very hard to estimate how strong either group is, but the people at the ground also don't know. And then at the end of the genocide, or even in a very short period, in sometimes a couple of months, sometimes in weeks, we see the opposition group, the opposition in group, just weaken. We see defections, and then the elites of that group lose their support bases. Whereas the elites, the genocidal elites, strengthen their support bases. And what we see is purges of rival elites and uh, therefore sort of in-group consolidation. Now, as I said, militias aren't great for fighting wars. Indiscriminate violence generates resistance. And so what you see sometimes is that even though the in-group gets closer, the out-group gets strengthened, particularly, for example, in Rwanda and in Cambodia, where uh, key members, elites of the in-group, defected to the other side, to the out-group. Which strengthens the outgroup. And so from the inside, we see very quick consolidation, but from the outside, these regimes are much weaker because they have all these internal weaknesses, and part of their support is uh, elites that don't necessarily support them all that well.
Interesting. One thing that you are talking about in this framework is the popular support, the signal popular support. I just want to play what we saw during the Tigray genocide, still
Hmm.
going on under a siege. Is there seemed to be, at least from the state media, the opposition media, the press, the free press, all that, everyone was like, behind the government, behind,
Hmm.
the one that is implementing this, right, doing this, to the extent that a singer who was talking about something against the war, the ongoing war at that time, um, during a rally to support the war, was had to pay the price in terms of reputation, all that, and so on. So let me just play a clip there on this mass support, and you might want to expand.
ልዘፍን አይደለም የመጣውን በደስታውን በሐዘን መስፈን ብቻ ነው እንዴ? የሚዘፈንና የማይዘፈን ቃል ይወቃ። እኔም ራሴ የቱ ጋር ቆመ ልስፈን? የቱ ጋር ቆመ ልዘምር? የቱ ጋር ቆመ ልናገር? እንደዚህ ተጣቧል ሰፈሩ። እኔ
So basically, he was opposing the war, is and so on. But then he had to come on media and to say sorry for saying that, because the support was so big and nationwide, if you will. So, what are you saying there? I mean, what did you see in this number of countries you saw in your research?
So one thing that is very obvious is that there's a lot of pressure to support. And there is a you're either with us or against us. If you're not with us, you're a traitor. And this makes sense also in a divided society. One of the first goals is to make sure that visibly everybody supports the violence. One thing that we saw in, well, say in Rwanda, for example, one thing that we saw is that killings always happen by day. That's and people went around to actually gather. So militias went around to gather the Hutu from different farmsteads, bring them together, and then plunder Tutsi farmsteads or kill. And even the people that didn't really want to go, they were sort of forced to go. You can imagine having a couple of teenagers with guns or machetes asking you to join. It's very hard to say no. Um, and this is something we see in many authoritarian regimes, whereby authoritarian regimes demand of their population visible support, and everybody is showing visible support. So even the civilians that did not want to kill, they were present. And we have civilians that were part of the killing group by day and then hiding Tutsi by night, right? So there's this sort of this pressure to visibly support the violence, whether you're in Russia, whether you're in China, whether you're in because the government will crack down very heavily on those that do not. And they'll use their thugs, they'll use their militias to make sure that people that don't are punished. And it's very visible what will happen to you if you don't. Which means that you then get everybody saying, well, I support the leader. I support the genocide. I support Kim Jong Un, or I'll cry for my leader. Right? Visible support is something that authoritarian regimes use, which we call preference for falsification. If you want to live a normal life, if you want your kids to go to a good school, if you want to make sure your family is okay and your job is okay, and you have a chance for promotion, in authoritarian regimes or at times of war, it's often best to keep your head down and to visibly support the regime. That's why we never quite know how much support there really is, because everybody knows their private preference. But if you privately are against the war and everybody is seemingly for the war, then it's very hard to step out. And this is one of the first steps that also signals to elites, hey, look, the population is with us. We are very well supported. You have no shot at stopping us. It suggests at lower level elites, well, you better pick the winner, or otherwise you're going to be punished. Your career is going to end. Your family is going to go without food. Your kids are not going to school, right? So people join uh, are quickly join the violent faction, I think.
And I'm showing the map of the countries you covered over the 54 years
Hmm.
of research. Did you see any unique circumstances where this rivalry, the support, um, is uniquely related to ethnic, cultural, religious, or it doesn't matter whether it's with these features or not?
It's difficult. So very often the outgroup is not random. So the outgroup can be an important ethnicity. Sometimes the outgroup has some power. Sometimes the outgroup uh, is uh, landowners, or right in Cambodia there, or the Lon Nol regime. In Indonesia, the outgroup was the communists, right, within the military and outside. So the outgroup isn't random. There is an outgroup. Usually there's some tension between the in-group and the outgroup, but there's choices there, and so elites or leaders or genocidal actors can choose to sort of put their own group in front of a established fact, a fait accompli, right? And they can put their own group in front of that, for example, through the violence or through the by starting a war and making sure that, well, suddenly all the soldiers are in this other country. There can no longer be a coup, and or we're targeting this outgroup. and you're either with us or against us. But on the other hand, in theory, everything can be an outgroup. Like in the Philippines, one could argue that the outgroup for Duterte was people that use drugs, drug addicts, and lower class people. Right, and so the outgroup can be defined quite loosely. In Pol Pot's Cambodia, the outgroup was first members of the Lon Nol regime, members of the previous regime. Then it was soldiers of that regime. First officers, then soldiers, then teachers, then landed farmers, then middle class farmers. There was always another outgroup, and the outgroup just grew and grew and grew, and the in group got smaller and smaller, and that society just became very small and well controlled by Pol Pot in a couple of years, where it was first he had all these warlord rivals, and by the end, just before he was defeated by Vietnam, he had sort of um, he was in full control of the country, and he had also purged the most powerful rivals in the east of the country. So yes, there is always there's often an ethnic component or a political component. The outgroup is not random. On the other hand, any group could feasibly be an outgroup.
Mm, mm. I mean, I can't help but notice that in your title of the paper and your dissertation, you use the words final solutions. And we know that these words are used almost in every genocide, in framing, there is a problem and we have tried to solve it in different ways, but it's not possible. So we solve it this way. Was that intentional?
Well, it is genocides are often seen as final solutions. Genocides are
Mhm,
often seen, well, there's nothing else we can do. We cannot deal with this outgroup. This is the only way we should deal with them. The other
mhm,
hand, there was also alluding to solutions to elite rivalry, right?
mhm,
Focusing on the elites, their political struggle, and their high risks for losing the struggle. Again, if you're uh, a burgomaster in Rwanda and you pick the wrong side, you're also killed. Also, if you're a Hutu, also if you're of the in group. So, final solution to elite rivalry, which I argue is the biggest danger to authoritarian elites. And in a country like Ethiopia, yes, there are elections, and Abiy won and will build a coalition. On the other hand, the structures are such there's quite a bit of elite violence that has occurred, and so the same some of the same problems that you might see in some other countries, you might also see in Ethiopia, where elites generate security, take power, consolidate by using violence against outgroups.
mhm. One thing that I think in your paper and in our discussion, in our conversation now, is there is a lot of factors at play, but most often than not, people, the media, the international community, you know, everyone just have a simplistic approach to whatever is happen has happened in these countries and what's happening as we speak as well in different areas like Tigray. So, what is it that the research among others you did shows there is a complex dynamics happening from those who are leading it, planning it, executing it, and those who are supporting it. Whereas the solution from the decision makers, international community is just a simple one saying, "Come together, talk to each other," all that.
Yeah, so one of the problems here is that in the cases where we are talking about elites trying to survive, in a dangerous environment and trying to grasp at straws, which killing out groups, starting wars with out groups, is not always the best approach. In that environment, elites have something to gain from the violence. There, the negotiation between the uh, the in and the out group doesn't quite matter because the elites from the in group, the from the genocidal group, they are trying to survive and they're trying to consolidate their position. The violence, the conflict is changing the relative power between elites. It is making sure that some troops are far away from the capital, for example. It's making so that militias are being created. It is making it's generating security for some elites. And as long as that is the case, solutions that rely on mediation don't work until this group has completely consolidated and there are no more rivals, and in that case there is room for mediation because then it starts to become a normal us versus them type of situation. um, but before that, there's not much that the international community can do because the stakes are so high for these elites. They are likely unwilling to really negotiate. They're likely unwilling to really end the fighting as long as they haven't yet secured their government, as long they haven't consolidated their power within their own regime fully. Um, that's one part. At the other hand, there is also some room for optimism, and that is that these regimes are very fragile from the outside because they have all this invisible internal tension. Um, Outside pressure, outside intervention might, which it did in Rwanda and it did in Cambodia, might bring a regime down much more quickly than we could have expected. And so there that is a potential consequence in this type of conflicts.
Hmm. One thing that specifically when you have a genocide uh, happening, isn't it in the interest of the genocidal group to finish it off instead of, for example, sitting, even in the case of consolidated power, to sit for negotiation?
I don't know, right? Once the cat is out of the bag, you could say, well, there is these militias and they're gaining from violence. They might as well finish. The other h- the other hand, we might see a lot of killing in a short period of time. We do see consolidated leaders become less violent. So one thing that I noticed is that if we look at these leaders at these times of high rivalry, they are very likely to well, they're very violent. Um, but afterwards, and we don't have that many cases, but if we think of a Mao or of a but even of a Suharto, we see that after this period, the violence just subsides. um, the militias are there. They are no longer as needed. The militias, actually, the militias can become a liability even. And one thing that I observed that I don't necessarily have a lot of evidence for is that after this violent period, the guns are often turned towards the militias, and they are violently taken out. At least their leaders are. And I think that's something we saw in China when the Red Guards were demobilized. I think it's also something in Indonesia. The militias remained, but they were sort of sidelined. They became unimportant. And so I think at some point the violence does stop. But by then, a lot of damage has been done already. And we're talking about when we're talking about killing civilians, it's not something you'd want to wait for.
Hmm, hmm. Interesting. One thing that a word that I was searching in your paper was media. I know you didn't cover that, but maybe the other aspect of it is as well the international actors. I mean, by that, so the power is between an elite, maybe within a country, a region, all that. But in the case of Tigray, for example, in Ethiopia, we know Eritrea was part of this, some Somalia troops were part of this, all that. So, is this something that maybe was not there during the data you covered, the period you covered, and a new development where regional powers as well are part of this kind of elite rivalry?
So I really focused on this sort of these sort of unexplained genocides. But in my research, I also look at just authoritarian regimes, and genocide isn't the only way to deal with this. We have the simple act of war, fighting somewhere, affects elite coalitions. Right? You can lock certain military units into fighting, making sure that they that their leaders cannot depose you. You can also restructure the military by putting them in certain uh, under a new structure while they are fighting. So they go on a campaign. You use a couple of troops from this faction, and make sure they have your officers and fight and become a working unit again. So there's things that authoritarian leaders can do. One thing that they can do is look for outside coalitions, right? This is one of the reasons why I think uh, uh, some countries were much less violent because they had a single outside supporter. Think, for example, of Cuba. Cuba had very soon, very early on, the support of the Soviet Union. It made Fidel Castro and his faction unchallenged, and so there wasn't a less need for violence. Eritrea, Afwerki, Abiy, they they may be dealing with similar problems, and they become perhaps a natural. They become natural allies, right? They um, not just against Tigray, but also to make sure that they don't have any internal enemies while they are fighting Tigray. And with Tigray, well, obviously there is a powerful faction there and an important part of Ethiopian history and government there. So that is another complicating factor. It's there are elites there that previously have been part of the regime. And I don't know enough about the actual war and the elite relations there to make to say a lot about that. But that the violence doesn't look random, right? It's just there are some indications of clear rivalry, and that might then also explain some of what we are seeing.
Hmm. Interesting. Maybe we're almost done with the show, but one thing that surprised me in the conclusion is the element of the fate of the genocidal group leader, all that. So you talk about a lower probability of adverse fate. I mean, is this something you expected beforehand?
No, not necessarily, but it was something that might be true, right?
Hmm.
It wasn't something I didn't. If
For
this,
our viewers, for our
yeah,
viewers, it's good if you talk about that subject, what you meant, all that. Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that I found is that leaders that use genocidal violence have a increased chance of survival. Uh, a slightly reduced chance of dying, a slightly reduced chance of being imprisoned, a reduced chance of being overthrown by internal enemies, which all fits with the idea that this violence isn't random, that this violence serves a purpose, that there is some sort of connection between elite rivalry on the one hand and the violence on the other, and that the violence doesn't necessarily hurt the leaders. Well, one thing that we might think, well, if the violence was completely random, or if it was just the outgroup, why would you, as a leader, fight both the outgroup and the in-group at the same time? Why not fight the in-group first? They are the most difficult challenge. You become fully consolidated. You have no one to stop you anymore, and then you start attacking the outgroup. But that's not what happened. It goes together, and that's weird. That's weird. And so I thought, well, if it is indeed true that these two are connected, then we should see some effect there. We should see that there's less challenges from the in group after the genocidal consolidation, and there is perhaps a little bit more damage from the out group because you're targeting the out group and they rebel and join together and may even win. Right, so it's a risky strategy, and this is what I found. I found when I paired leaders that were using genocidal consolidation to those leaders that were most similar. And that was just some sort of model whereby I sort of fit the leaders on a variety of characteristics. To those that were most similar, then we see, well, the ones that do use the violence survive a little more, get imprisoned a little less, get overthrown internally a little less. Not quite significant, but there was some sort of effect of from the outside. So they also lost civil wars a little more, and so that fits the intuition that these two things are not disconnected, and that these leaders have sort of themselves an intuition. They don't necessarily have to know the entire process, but just, hey, I have this problem of other elites. Let me throw sand in the engine. Let me pay a couple of militias. Let me rile them up and see where it goes and see if I survive. And I did a second thing at the start of this broadcast. I said something about the difference between counter guerrilla and non-counter guerrilla mass violence. And then so I was thinking, well, if this is the case, then we can sort of do this analysis again, but now we do it with the counter guerrilla ones. And the counter guerrilla genocides, they really shouldn't have any additional security versus elites. They shouldn't really help against this death and imprisonment. And when I did this as a sort of a placebo to see where that ends, then I say, well, counter guerrilla mass violence helps against losing civil wars, being thrown from the outside, but it doesn't help you internally. So that connection between this internal rivalry and this genocidal consolidation, that is there. Is that the end of it? No, I don't necessarily think so. This is the start of the research on that connection. But I think it's a very important connection. I think it's very important that almost all of these mass killings that we can't explain in any other way have this mass rivalry. That this rivalry isn't resolved first and then we see the killing. No, we see the killing and the rivalry, and we see the killing resolve the rivalry, and then we see less killing. So that for me indicates that yes, there is ideology, but elite rivalry is strongly connected to mass killing.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, there is an additional layer, when it comes to countries like Ethiopia, even during the ongoing genocide, there is an interest from the international community, like keeping Ethiopia's, unified. Then,
Hmm.
don't touch the leader, don't touch him, or all that. So there is, I think, that speaks to your conclusion of less adverse impact or fate to the leaders. Before we finish, the last question from me is, yes, you have seen this 54 years of data, number of countries on almost all continent, uh, and it's after the fact. So is there any way those who want to address ongoing genocide, be it the international community, regional organizations, even those who are fighting against the genocide, is there a toolbox you can they can get inspired from? I mean, from your research,
So
using understanding it
so
and getting out of it.
so one thing is think of the authoritarian component and think of authoritarian politics. And oftentimes, authoritarian politics is a black box, but we don't know. But it isn't, which is one of the reasons why I look back. Like me from the ivory tower, trying to understand these authoritarian processes, it's very hard in real time. Afwerki won't. He won't tell me to come to his mansion and talk to me, right? There's no right. Definitely, he won't say that there are people that would challenge him. And Mugabe wouldn't either, because that would be a sign of weakness. So these authoritarian regimes and these regimes that are sort of in flux, semi-authoritarian, they have an incentive not to show whenever there's rivalry. And yet, I may not know, but some people do. There are real signs, there are real signals, and once there is this competition, like it was in Myanmar between different factions of the military, some people notice. And one thing that I would suggest is to look much more carefully at these processes. We sort of know the country attributes of which societies are at some risk of genocidal violence, but we don't know when it happens. So my suggestion is look at at those rivalries, because those are very dangerous times, which means that are times that we might help. Um, we can think as an international community, okay, how can we affect rivalry, or how can we secure people? We can think of things like golden parachutes, perhaps, or pushing people out. We can think about interventions that may be cheaper or at least less risky than they seem because of this internal struggle. Um, Media wise, I think the awareness helps. It's also it's very hard, because I where can you really help people, right? And it becomes especially problematic in cases where a state cannot be challenged because the state is too strong and the political will is too weak to really intervene. Um, Here, also in negotiations, keep in mind that there are elites fighting for survival that are at the table. There may also be elites fighting for survival that are not at the table. One might be able to leverage that, but I haven't thought that through how in full.
Hmm. I think and hope that this is a subject matter that you'll be researching on more, and others,
I will.
colleagues of you. And I really hope as well to speak to you on your research and your insight for what's happening down there and elsewhere. But for today, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you very much. I was very happy to come, and thank you so much. And good luck.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
You have been following us live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn. Today, I had the pleasure of conversing with Dr. Van der Maat from Leiden University in the Netherlands. And the topic was genocidal power consolidation, final solutions for two elite rivalry. This was based on his research from 2015 as a dissertation and published as a peer reviewed in the International Organization Journal in 2020. I will see you with the H panel on Friday. And until then, bye from now.